Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Now, we've had an action-packed week when it comes to the unfolding of Russiagate. We are now in a climate of severe and protracted intelligence warfare. And we want to tell you all about that because this is now getting to be a wilderness of mirrors. And we're going to show you the way through it. However, before we get into analysis and commentary, we have got to address the principal activist tasks that are now on the table. And first and foremost, we have the Gorsuch nomination. I have been delving into the ideology, the past career, the associations, the sponsorships behind the Gorsuch nomination. And I tell you that this is getting more and more sinister the more the analysis proceeds. It is clearly an imperative that this person be denied a seat on the Supreme Court. And any reason to vote against them is a good reason. Now, since we talked to you last week, the perspective of stopping Gorsuch with a filibuster has become much more realistic. It is now within our grasp, right? This started with Chucky Schumer saying about a week ago that it would be time to oppose him, to filibuster him in effect. And we've also had the provocative and arrogant and brazen announcement by Mitch McConnell, the leader of the legions of greed in the Senate, the guy who says that money is speech. Mitch McConnell has told us with an ultimatum that there's going to be a vote, or he doesn't even say when the vote will be, but what he says is that by next Friday, 1 week from now, and that's, this is now, today is the 31st of March. It's the end of the first quarter of this troubled year. And that means that on the 7th of April, on April 7th, we're told the legions of greed are going to put Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. This is unacceptable. It's time to get active and mobilize. And fortunately, because of the previous mobilizations, because of the 5.5 million people that were in the streets on the 21st of January, the biggest political demonstration in American history. That's one superlative that the current administration can vaunt if they want to, that they have called out the biggest political backlash of any presidency ever in U.S. history. The 5.5 million in the U.S. and the international dimension, another 500,000, of which 100,000 in London alone, showing that Brexit is not going down in terms of ideology with the British people. What the effect of those demonstrations has been, combined with all the town hall meetings and all the other protests and all of the infinite variety of slow, methodical, sometimes seemingly pedestrian political work, leaflets, signs, phone calls, and so forth, all of this adds up to a situation where Democratic senators, you can see some of whom would be delighted to sell out on this issue, right? They'd be out there saying, what a fine man, what a decent man. Surely this is the kind of person, doesn't he look the part? Isn't he Central Casting's idea of what a Supreme Court justice should look like? Well, no, because this is an ideologue of oligarchy as against the people, of the elites as against the 99%. And that's the story of this guy's life. So the Democratic Party has been prevented from taking its usual path of capitulation and cowardice And instead, we have what amounts to a fairly decent showing, but there's more to be done. So let's get down to business on this. As of right now, and right now it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, the 31st of March, 2017, the whip count, and I'm going by the NBC News whip count, which is updated periodically. It's been updated in the last couple of days. We now have 35 Democratic senators committed to a filibuster. 35 on the side of the filibuster. Those who oppose a filibuster and in some cases say that they may or will vote for Gorsuch are 2. These unfortunate cases are Manchin of West Virginia and Heitkamp of North Dakota. And these are unfortunate places where people remain confused, unenlightened. They're not alerted to what's actually going on. So you can figure that. But I wouldn't give up on either one of them. Don't give up on Manchin and don't give up on Heitkamp. Talk to them too, especially if you're in those states. But the ones that we also need to mention are the 11 Democratic senators who are undecided, on the fence, vacillating. And that now comes down to the following. Since we're going in alphabetical order, we're going to start with Ben Cardin of Maryland. And again, I think what some of these people want to do is they like to posture at public expense. They love to posture. They say, well, my maxim has always been that we need to give somebody a fair up and down vote. We don't want to be too partisan, except we do. Ben Cardin, you are on notice. This is Maryland, and you had better join that filibuster. You better take the lead in convincing some other people on the vacillating fence-sitting list that they've got to come out and join the filibuster, make sure that it holds, and then, do the obvious voting. So vote against Cloture and, of course, vote against Gorsuch if it ever gets to that. But if it ever does, given the Republican majority, then we're in big trouble. So Ben Cardin of Maryland is undecided. Help him to decide. Help him to clear his mind. Right? The idea that his base is boiling mad might help to clear his mind. Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Oh, my gosh. Bob Menendez of New Jersey needs to be prodded in the filibuster camp. Chris Coons of Delaware. Shame on you, Senator. You better join that filibuster. Claire McCaskill of Missouri. Obviously a right-wing Democrat, but there's no more room for such people. They've got to decide, where do you stand? Dianne Feinstein from California. Senator Feinstein, you seriously think that your behavior represents what the people of California want? Or are you posturing with the collegiality and the bonhomie of the Senate? We don't care about that. We don't care about your process. It's time to make sure that a dangerous ideologue is kept off the Supreme Court. Joe Donnelly of Indiana. I realize it's a tough vote for you, Senator, but you've got to come down in favor of the filibuster. The same goes for John Tester of Montana, right? He's up for election next year. That's no excuse. Tester, you expect Democratic activists to come out and staff your campaign. They will not if you do not join this filibuster. Mark Warner. Oh, my God. Here's somebody, an expert in posturing. This is somebody who loves to show how bipartisan he was, as he did this week. Commodities, and we'll give you the rest of the list here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. World Crisis Radio. It's the end of the first quarter. And boy, these have been troubled times, but I think I'm beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel, to coin a Vietnam phrase. And we're going to do some Watergate phraseology later in the show. But first, let me remind you This program comes out once a week, and we put everything in it that we can. But if you want to get up to date with clear analysis and, above all, clear action perspectives Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, make sure that you subscribe to The American System. The American System. Go to theamericансystem.tv, and for a mere bagatelle, you can get a subscription to hear this 4 days a week. So that means you'll be covered from Monday through Thursday, and then again on Saturday, or indeed all of these, once they're up, they stay up, and you can always get them. So please do that, americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Support my work. It's going to be important. I think I can guide you through some of these things. We got to go back to Watergate. We got to go back to Iran-Contra. Got to go back to Ken Starr. We're getting into this terrain of really protracted intelligence warfare. So let's just remind everybody, we're giving you the list of the Democratic senators that have got to be convinced by their constituents that this agnostic, opportunistic, cowardly, fence-sitting, undecided, it's unacceptable. Ben Cardin of Maryland, Bob Menendez of New Jersey, Chris Coons of Delaware, Claire McCaskill of Missouri, Dianne Feinstein of California, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, John Tester of Montana, Mark Warner of Virginia. Yes, Senator Warner, we know how bipartisan you are and how palsy-walsy you are with Richard Burr of North Carolina, and how you're trying to show us that the Senate is so much better than the House and those louts over on the other side of the hill. The problem with that outlook, Senator Warner, is I know that you're willing to put your hand in the fire for Senator Burr, but I'm not. And you got to remember, Nunes seemed to be perfectly reasonable up until the time that he wasn't. And all it takes is some kind of a phone call or some kind of a signal, and Burr will turn into a super Nunes. So don't trust him. You cannot build your perspective on that. Don't tell us about the adults in the room and all the rest of these idiotic cliches, right? Bipartisanship is not the goal. The opposite. The goal should be the extinction of the Republican Party as a menace to the future of the United States. The extinction of the Republican Party seemed to have been clouded since the first week in November, but now it's back with a vengeance, confirming my perspective. So these are simply editorial comments. What you need to do, obviously, is call Senator Warner and say, look, Senator, you gotta join the filibuster against Gorsuch. Gorsuch is to the right of the current Supreme Court. The 8 of them voted that his treatment of the autistic boy, the autistic student, was cruel and unusual. They overturned him. They repudiated him in the middle of his hearings. And, of course, when it comes to regulation, Scalia was bad, very bad, but Gorsuch is worse. Gorsuch is going to overthrow even this Chevron deference, which essentially will mean open season on any and all federal regulations. And this is a disaster. This is the descent into chaos, anarchy, the law of the jungle, and it's the little people who will be sacrificed. And that's the one constant note in the jurisprudence of Gorsuch, right? It's the favoring the 1%, the big corporation, over the man in the street, right? The figure in the carpet, who are us. Michael Bennett of Colorado is undecided. Help him to decide. Patrick Leahy of Vermont also needs to have the outlook clarified for him. He may be beyond the last roundup in electoral terms, but he does have a reputation, and, he needs to get it from the shoulder. And Angus King, an independent. Some people think that's good. I've always been very skeptical about these fussy independents who are so concerned with the process and so oblivious to the outcomes for the 99%, and indeed for the, let's get down to about the 50 million. In other words, the people that still are not going to have insurance. They have food stamps if they're lucky, and are subjected to the risk of poverty and food insecurity and all the rest. We got to think about them. Stop thinking about the collegiality and the chortling in the faculty lounge at the Senate. Don't do this. It's not worth it. So those are the senators. And again, you can follow this. It's on the NBC News Politics Supreme Court page. These are the Democrats voting against Neil Gorsuch. You should make sure you get your senator onto that list, because otherwise it is shameful. It is shameful. I'm ashamed of Maryland that we can't provide some leadership, right? It's not just your one little tormented, tortured vote at the end of the day. That's no good. You got to get out in front weeks in advance and say, I'm going to vote against this guy, and I'm going to invoke the filibuster. Hats off on that to the senator from Oregon, right? Jeff Merkley, who weeks ago said that he would filibuster Gorsuch. That's the kind of Democratic Party that would help the United States, not this collection of gutless wonders. All right. The other one is, since we're on organizing tasks, early voting has begun in Georgia 6, that congressional district, which is, they're fortunate, right? They should count their lucky stars. They're getting rid of Tom Price. So he's not going to be the congressman there anymore, because he's now been given the biggest budget in the federal government to work with, to work against, to wreck, that is Health and Human Services. So they got to have a new congressman. And we have this guy, Jon Ossoff, Ossoff, in Georgia 6, who is running at least neck and neck and quite possibly ahead of a number of the Republican contenders in the second round. When it gets to the first round, Ossoff is leading the pack with about 40%. But that's the first round. This is a little bit like the French election, right? If nobody gets the absolute majority, as I understand it, then they go on to a second round. So we want to give you the need to intervene on that. Right? Get active on that one too. And back in a minute, crisis. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we have actually the first polling of any consequence, at least recently, in this election. And leading the pack is Ossoff with 40% or so in the first round. And the second candidate there in the first round would be Karen Handel. And I will forego the puns about famous composers. This woman would be bad news. And above all, we must put the fear of God into the reactionary Republicans. They are triumphing, right? The extreme Tea Party, the so-called Freedom Caucus, feel like they're on top of the world. They need to be shown that their crackpot policies, by taking away the health insurance of the American people, this is absolutely unacceptable. Remember, if you put a Republican in, you're giving power to the Tea Party, even if the Tea Party is not the person that you're voting against. Remember what they wanted to do. Not content with getting rid of the 10 essential medical benefits that had been mandated as parts of all insurance policies that you could call an insurance policy. No, that was not enough. They wanted to go on to restore the ability of insurance companies to deny you coverage based on a pre-existing condition. That was the Republican demand. And that your children, as they grow up, could not stay on your insurance policy until age 26. They wanted to kick them off when? At 18? or 21. I don't know. Tell us, reactionary Republicans. And this is not dead. This is still there. So it's imperative. We have to have one fewer vote for this insanity and also scare the daylights out of these other characters, right? So we've got Ossoff with 40% and Handel at 20%. And there are a bunch of others. There's 2 or 3 more Republican Party characters at the heels of this Karen Handel. There's no point in electing a Republican ideologue. They all lie. They have to, right? In other words, the cohesion of the Republican Party is based on mendacity, and it starts at the top, and it then becomes the obligatory doctrine is mendacity. That's all they have, right? You can't be a loyal Republican unless you're willing to lie like crazy, right? And remember, a lie is an attempt to deceive, and this is not viewed positively by the great monotheistic religions, okay? So, including Christianity, the one that might be familiar to some of the people in this area, right? I'm sure others are too. So, there we go. Reactionary forces have put another $1 million into this in the past week or so. So the Republicans will have $2.2 million to spend, and it's important to redress that. So do the obvious. Volunteer somehow. Get on social media. Call attention to this. Ossoff may not be an ideal candidate. He may be flawed. He may not be something to write home about. But nevertheless, Ossoff can be the right candidate in the right place at the right time with the right message, which is a $15 minimum wage. Is that worth voting for? I think it is. Just that. That would already do a lot, because that would move the entire pay scale in this country up away from the coolie wages and the low-wage economy. See, the idea with these free trade Republicans, free trade and low wages go together, as they did, for example, in the Confederacy, right? The Confederate Constitution that said you could not have a protective tariff. It was in the Confederate Constitution, Montgomery, Alabama, 1861. No protective tariff, only a modest revenue tariff. So don't let this go by. The first round is the 18th of April. The second round comes then in the following month of May. So if Ossoff could go from 40% to 51%, I think at that point it would be over, wouldn't it? I'm not an expert in the election laws of Georgia, but you get the idea, right? These are supposedly the Atlanta suburbs, the northern suburbs of Atlanta, areas of greater enlightenment and culture and so forth. So if that's true, dear Georgians, then we hope you'll show us. And anybody, anywhere can get involved, right? And if this guy needs a contribution, it's probably worth investing in. So those, I think, are the two of the main agitational tasks, right? When we're talking agitation, we're talking about things that ought to get done. Then we also have this indispensable area of analysis and understanding. Now, this past week has, of course, been turbulent in the extreme. And to evoke this climate, I guess you do have to go back to Watergate in particular, but Iran-Contra, some insights have been drawn. We've heard about these things in terms of questions of immunity, the immunity that Oliver North got from the Congressional Committee that then prevented Oliver North from being successfully prosecuted through the appeals. He was able to get off. Now, remember that the backdrop for this is the crisis of the House intelligence community and the bizarre antics of Congressman Devin Nunes, a Republican from the Central Valley of California. He apparently is a latifundist, right? He's a big farmer, but farmer. He's a landlord. He's a landowner, latifundist, and with a large landed estate. Look at it that way. So Nunes has been behaving in a way that, according to some observers, let's say, some observers would say that Nunes's behavior amounts to obstruction of justice. In other words, it's the deliberate attempt to obstruct a process of investigation. He might also be in contempt of Congress. That would be, I think, uncharted territory, but this is perfectly possible. So you'll remember what this was. On Tuesday evening of last week, that was the 21st of March, he received a phone call from the White House. We think we know who called him. We believe, at least according to the New York Times, that he received this information, reportedly, New York Times and others conclude, from two people in the White House staff. That would be Ezra Cohen Watnick, W-A-T-N-I-C-K, who is the intelligence director of the National Security Council, and or Michael Ellis, who is also part of the White House staff. And we'll talk about these people here in just a minute. Nunes then ran down to the White House that evening. According to some, this was a midnight ride for Nunes. And what you get the feeling when you're going through this, you're talking about memes, right? These elements of the fable, right? The component parts of the fable are the memes. And you're getting the idea of memes that will now, before too long, they will be considered in the same way as the smoking gun tape of Watergate or the enemies list or things like this. So we're going to bring you up to date on Nunes and his confederates there in the White House when we come back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley speaking from an overcast Washington, D.C. So let's look at this chain of events now. We have Nunes on Tuesday, March 21st in the evening sometime late. Is called over to the White House, allegedly now by Cohen Watnick and or Michael Ellis. These are the allegations of the New York Times and others. And then on the following day, Wednesday, that would be the 22nd of March, he gave a phone call sometime in the period there to Speaker Ryan, who undoubtedly told him what to do. And then Nunes went down to the White House again, supposedly briefed the White House on what the White House had told him the day before. We don't know who he talked to. And then another press conference. So press conference on the Hill, go to the White House, brief the White House on what they already knew, and then a press conference informally in the White House driveway. So Nunes has now gone careening into action as a wrecker of his own investigation. And in particular, there was a public hearing scheduled for Tuesday of this past week, which Nunes canceled unilaterally. He's been acting unilaterally and in a very partisan way for the whole time. And Nunes, of course, has not shared whatever information he allegedly got at the White House. This information has never been shared, not with the ranking Democrat, Schiff, not with the Democrats on the committee, and as far as I can tell, not even with the Republicans on the committee. The Republicans on the committee are the unsung, they're the supernumeraries in this whole thing, right? They apparently count for absolutely nothing. Ryan and others have tried to create the impression that Nunes's information suggested, yes, there was some kind of nefarious, illegal, inappropriate monitoring, surveillance of the Trump campaign and the candidate. But and that the people who were providing the information were whistleblowers. Well, they weren't whistleblowers. They were people on the White House staff who essentially laundered this information through the feckless, hapless Nunes and got that onto the evening news. Okay, so this is very, very strange stuff. But the main thing was there was going to be an open hearing on Tuesday. This would have been an open hearing on the manner of the previous Monday's hearing. The previous Monday was, of course, when Comey of the FBI came forward to say there is no basis for alleging that Obama wiretapped Trump Tower at any point, said Comey. And then, however, there is an active criminal counterintelligence investigation of the Trump campaign and its connections to Russia. So apparently that had unleashed tremendous consternation at the White House, and then the wires began to crackle up to the Hill, and Nunes was told, make sure you don't have any more hearings like that. That's the guess. Therefore, the Tuesday hearing was going to feature who? It was going to feature Sally Yates. Sally Yates is the brave public servant who went to the White House in the first week of the new presidency, something like January 25th or 26th or something like this, and told them, watch out, your National Security Council director, Michael Flynn, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, is someone who is compromised, and he is blackmailable by foreign intelligence services. Flynn. And of course, what did the White House do? They did nothing for approximately 17, 18 days, almost 3 weeks. They left Flynn in place, continuous access to all the secrets of the United States. I think virtually without any exceptions, the NSC director can see just about anything. They left him in place, and finally they fired him, claiming that it had been discovered that he lied to Vice President Pence about the nature of his contacts with a Russian diplomat. But that somehow doesn't add up, right? Why wait 3 weeks if that's all there was? So Yates, of course, herself, later in that same week, or the following Monday, the ban, immigration and refugee ban, went into action on the 27th of January, the Friday in the evening. And by Monday afternoon, Yates was saying the Department of Justice under my leadership, she was acting AG. General Yates at that point said, no, we're not going to defend that because we think it's unconstitutional. She was then fired. So now this is a lady with plenty to tell, right? Talk about somebody with a story to tell. It would be Yates. So Yates was going to be joined by Brennan, the CIA boss under Obama, and Clapper, the director of national intelligence also under Obama. That was going to be a public hearing. That was called off. And as far as we can tell, the work of the House intelligence community has virtually come to a grinding halt. So this essentially means that an action to disrupt and indeed to obstruct the work of this committee has gone on. Now, the big news, of course, from yesterday being the 30th of March, is that Flynn, through his lawyer, a guy called Kellner, Kelner, the author of the letter, has first of all really asserted Fifth Amendment constitutional rights. He's not going to talk. He will not talk. That's what this letter to me really means. He's not going to talk, and instead he's asking for a grant of immunity. use immunity, I think is the term they have. Use immunity is that anything he says, as long as it's true, as long as he doesn't commit perjury, but if he tells the truth, he can't be prosecuted for the material that he gives under this grant. Now, there's always the theoretical possibility that an eager prosecutor could prove through some other means and was not using the testimony but finding out in totally independent ways that they could then come around and indict him anyway. And this, of course, takes us right back to those fabled days of yesteryear, the Iran-Contra scandal, when Oliver North, working in the White House for Poindexter of the NSC and Vice President George H.W. Bush, these are things you can read about in my book, The Unauthorized Biography of George H.W. Bush, 1992. You can buy reprints for a reasonable price. It used to be very expensive, but now there are reprints. You can go and find those, and please do. With this, you can also see that Oliver North was part of this operation with Felix Rodriguez and quite a few others. He was given immunity by the Joint Congressional Committee, Senator Inouye and company. They gave Oliver North immunity, so he got to tell his story and become a celebrity on TV. But then later on, the very diligent and very public-spirited special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, came around and indicted Oliver North and convicted him. But the conviction was struck down because of the previous grant of use immunity by the Congressional Committee. So that's the terrain we're getting into. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., and we are now in the midst of a new Watergate. We have got scandals rolling along, and the outcome is, at this point, somewhat undeterminate, but it is not good for the incumbent. This much is for sure. And it's always interesting to compare the degree of shock and outrage that the antics of Nixon generated in those more innocent years compared to the jaded and brutalized decade that we now live in, right? We'll be talking about some of that stuff as time goes on, and especially if you go over to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, you can follow all of that analysis, right? Because there are cultural factors, right, that help to set the stage for politics. Anyway, on the Twitter feed this morning, the chief executive writes, Mike Flynn should ask for immunity in that this is a witch hunt, paren, excuse for big election loss, close paren, by media and Dems of historic proportion. A big election loss? Well, no, a rather close election, right? 306 electoral votes. Bush the elder got up to about 425. So what is meant by this? So I don't know if Trump knows what he's doing, because if he says Flynn should ask for immunity, and suppose he gets it, what's he going to do? He's going to sing. He's going to turn state's evidence. He has to. That's what immunity means. And he will then essentially tell all, and that all cannot be good for the current administration and for many individuals in it. Now we got to get granularity. I'm hearing granularity on from officials this week, right? Granularity. What's granularity? I haven't heard this since the 9/11 Commission. They were talking about granularity. So the granularity in this case is the we have a New York Times article that when when Nunes went to the White House on his midnight ride last Tuesday to Wednesday, we believe, a pair of White House officials helped to provide Nunes with the intelligence reports that showed President Trump and his associates were incidentally swept up in foreign surveillance by American spy agencies. Now, Nunes is universally ridiculed and discredited as somebody who is eager to do the bidding of the Trump administration. But there's also the question of who helped him. And the New York Times claims to have 4 U.S. officials, not all of them on all the points, but generally speaking, on the general outlines, 4 sources, right? Rule is 2, then you can triple check. They have quadruple checked. So, I don't think you could just say fake news, right? That's quite a mantra. So, the 2 officials, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, technically the senior director for intelligence at the National Security Council, and Michael Ellis, a lawyer who works on national security issues at the White House Counsel, means he's on the staff of this guy, McGahn, M-C-G-A-H-N, the personal lawyer for the president. Neither has been accused of breaking laws, but they have sought to use intelligence to advance the political goals of the Trump administration. Sean Spicer refused to confirm the names of Ellis and Cohen-Watnick, but, and this is funny coming from these people, Spicer says, the obsession with who talked to whom and when is not the answer. It should be the substance. Now, this is a White House which can only survive if we're more interested in the process of who leaked and who provided the documents, and ignore the substance on the overarching Russiagate theme. Forget the substance, says the White House, except in this case, they say the substance is what counts. Now, when they got a hold of this, we had Cohen-Watnick going to work. In other words, when Trump put out those infamous Saturday morning Twitters, right, that he had been wiretapped and bugged in Trump Tower, the officials here, let's see the way they have it. This is Maggie Haberman and her group. The officials who detailed the newly disclosed White House role said that this month, shortly after Trump claimed on Twitter that he had been wiretapped during the campaign by Obama, Cohen-Watnick began reviewing a backlog of secret dispatches, okay? Meaning, well, that he was using intelligence assets for political spin, right? For political defense, right? He was trying to go through secret, special intelligence documents and going through it. Now, before we leave these 2 characters, right? Both of them are very young and very inexperienced. Right? It is, for example, inconceivable that this guy Cohen-Watnick, at the age of 30, with no depth of experience, right, essentially doesn't really know very much about anything at all, Cohen-Watnick gets to be, in some ways, the top intelligence officials in the White House, right? What is his expertise? And we can tell you a couple of things about him, right? There's a profile of him here in the Daily Forward, right? And it's interesting. Ezra Cohen-Watnick, the secret source at the center of the Trump-Russia probe. So he's 30 years old. He is someone he grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and University of Pennsylvania. He's a 2008 college kid. So he had worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency under Flynn. He met Flynn, and Flynn was removed. Later on, the neocon Crystal says, I find it inconceivable that Cohen-Watnick and Ellis were acting on their own at the White House because these guys are so junior. But anyway, he comes in with Flynn, and then General McMaster, the current head of the National Security Council, sought to fire Cohen-Watnick from the team because the CIA director, I think this means Pompeo, had pointed to problems that his intelligence officers were having when dealing with Cohen-Watnick. Questions were raised about his ability to carry out the position of senior NSC director for intelligence programs, who oversees ties with the intelligence agencies. In other words, what intelligence should go to the president? Well, that's sort of the NSC guy, but he's got to rely on Cohen-Watnick. So Cohen-Watnick was about to be fired, even though Bannon and some others were apparently on his side. But Trump intervened personally after Bannon and Kushner had also attempted to keep him. So this is where Trump is saying to McMaster, you've got to keep this kid, Cohen-Watnick. So he reviewed highly classified intelligence reports detailing intercepted communications of foreign officials, and out of this he gleaned all kinds of stuff about how Trump and the Trump campaign were being caught up in existing wiretaps on foreign individuals. So that's all from the forward. Very, very interesting. Be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we've given you some idea of who this Ezra Cohen-Watnick is, somebody who he escaped firing by the skin of his teeth. McMaster didn't want him. The intelligence community complained about him. He's obviously an ideologue. And then the other guy mentioned by the New York Times is, of course, Michael Ellis. And this is another fresh-faced kid. This is someone who is, he's at the ripe old age of 32. He is a lawyer on the staff of McGahn, right, the White House counsel, and Ellis worked for Nunes as general counsel for the House Intelligence Committee before he went to the White House. So you get the idea. Cohen-Watnick represents Flynn from the DIA, and this Ellis represents the Nunes group, right? And again, the New York Times is making these claims. So this guy is what? He's from Dartmouth, and he was on the Dartmouth Review. Now this, of course, this is this reactionary rag, which has produced people like, I think Laura Ingraham comes out of the Dartmouth Review, which of course in the 1980s, this was an attempt to regroup reactionaries on the various Ivy League campuses. So with Ellis, he's from Yale Law School. He's been in the Navy. He clerked for 2 federal judges, but he was an aide to Karl Rove. So I guess he learned some political maneuvering and trickery from the architect. And then he worked for Mitt Romney on the Mitt Romney campaign. So this is a partisan, okay? And he met his wife at Dartmouth, and the young couple and all this. So, and he was on Jeopardy. This is the other amazing thing. He was a contestant on the television game show Jeopardy in 2013, where he won $18,401. All right, so what are these characters up to? Here's an interesting insight, right? When you get to the point where you're going through top secret stuff and you're trying to glean things about what the intelligence community knows about you, that is you, the White House, here's an interesting thing. Now, this is Barton Gellman. Barton Gellman, Gellman, he is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, And his article is entitled, "Is the Trump White House Spying on the FBI?" Very interesting questions. And it revolves around this stuff, right? Really the misuse of what some of this stuff was. So he goes through the story. McMaster tried to fire Cohen-Watnick, who had been imposed by Flynn. Trump personally ordered McMaster not to fire him. And Ellis coming from the Nunes side of things. Now, Gelman, of course, interestingly, he's open. He says, look, I'm not really the guy for secrets, because he took part in revealing the Snowden NSA information. But here we go from Gelman, right? Because he knows his way around the IC. Based on what Nunes has said in public, it looks like he was shown verbatim transcripts. In other words, not cover sheets, not tear sheets, as they're apparently called in the jargon of the IC. So the likelihood is that Nunes, when he was shown purportedly by Cohen-Watnick and by Ellis, that he was shown sensitive verbatim transcripts. These are always classified as TS/SI, Special Intelligence, or TS/Comment, Communications Intelligence, right? I guess SIGINT is what it used to be, Signals Intelligence, which means that they could reveal sources and methods if disclosed. This is the first apparent breach of secrecy rules. In other words, this little stunt that they put together breaches the security regulations. And then the impromptu news conference. According to Gelman, there is no unclassified way to speak in public about the identity of a target or an incidentally collected communicant in a surveillance operation. So the idea also is some of these things that reach the White House, instead of saying minimized U.S. person or minimized U.S. campaign official and other offices, quite possible. In order to get the names on those, this is where you have to ask back. In other words, we've been told now, I think we can say that if the FBI or the NSA sends you something that just says U.S. person, if you're a legit federal agency, you can say, here, we need to know who this is. So if they did that, it would mean that the White House has been trying to find out, what the intelligence community knows about various components of the Trump campaign, among other things. And this would mean, that they're looking into how they themselves are being investigated. Here's the conclusion. Why would a White House lawyer and a top White House intelligence advisor, writes Spartan Gelman, be requesting copies of these surveillance reports in the first place? Why would they then ask back for the names to be unmasked? There is no chance that the FBI would brief them about the substance or progress of this investigation into the Trump campaign's connections to the Russian government. Were the president's men, Watergate, using the surveillance assets of the U.S. government to track the FBI investigation of them from the outside? Well, that's the question, right? So is the purpose of this just a public political defense so you have some good talking points, or are you really trying to find out what's happening? And then if you do find out what's happening, what are you going to do about that? So, couple of things now. In terms of Flynn, you'll remember at the time of the fall of Flynn, which I think was 13th of February, we're always told that he was on the job for 23 days. There was a White House official who was widely denounced by the reactionary parts of the community as being the source of leaks that had led to the demise of Flynn. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Now, when Flynn was forced out, and I think that was again the 13th of February, on or about, a lot of the pro-Trump, the extreme wing of that, came out and said there's a leaker in the White House. Right? There still is, but especially in that first month, there was this huge brouhaha about all the leaking coming out of the White House, and what a scandal. And allegedly, reportedly, according to certain of these websites, they were pointing the finger at Katie Walsh. And Katie Walsh had been the chief of staff at the Republican National Committee working for Reince Priebus. So this was Priebus's right-hand person, his girl Friday, I guess. She was known as his eyes and ears. She was known as Madam President. And whenever she saw somebody going in to see Trump, we have one report that she would run, literally run, in order to make sure that Priebus knew exactly what was happening, especially if he hadn't been informed. So she is now out. So she's the deputy White House chief of staff. Priebus remains as White House chief of staff with two deputies. One of them, Katie Walsh, is out. The other one, the White House people claim that the other deputy chief of staff is somebody they're absolutely going to keep. Katie Walsh is not simply fired, though. She is transferred to an outside pro-Trump group. And there's a sort of semi-plausible explanation, plausible denial in terms of the reference point back there in the Nixon years, plausible denial that this is a political sacking, or that it might have anything to do with leaking, that she is now going to, her responsibility is to make sure that there's better coordination. The idea was this. Last week, as the Trump care, Ryan care went down to defeat, there was a lot of complaining by the supporters of Ryan and Trump that they wanted to see TV ads in the districts of these Freedom Caucus characters, trying to get them to support it. In other words, they said, we didn't have any air cover. We didn't have any air cover happening, or not enough, and therefore we've got to do a better job in coordinating. Now, they say that Katie Walsh was a very competent, methodical administrator. She had this career, again, from the Republican National Committee, and she's a Priebus loyalist. So it may simply be that this is a pretext, or, I think clearly it has something to do with the failure in the quest to wipe out Obamacare. Notice also, though, that Priebus is now left significantly more isolated. And the great speculation now of the weekend is, will Priebus be next? The White House says Priebus will not be next. But the fact of having to answer that is not so good. Now, here's another interesting figure, not just Katie Walsh from the Priebus camp is being forced out, or forced to leave the White House, right? And they've said, oh, she's so selfless. This is not a promotion, that's for sure. Here we have this guy, Boris Epstein, Epshteyn. And, he was born what was then the Soviet Union. And he has now left the Trump White House. This was a guy who had a very important role in organizing the inauguration. Maybe that was not exactly successful. So here we're reading on the Daily Kos, is this guy, that Sean Spicer would not comment on why Boris Epstein was leaving. And that the question they ask over at the Daily Kos is the Epstein departure directly linked to the Russiagate scandal? Russian-born investment banker and attorney, and there are various unsubstantiated reports that he too is somehow under fire for leaking or for blabbing or for talking too much or for embarrassing Trump, for various other things that, anyway, you can get the idea that probably the Trump White House, they think, we've got altogether enough Russia stuff going on, right? The less Russia, this is the White House, not the Russia House. So we got to clear some of these people out, because if you're Boris Epstein, born in the Soviet Union, then this always raises this same story. By the way, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman of the Kremlin, right, the spokesman for the Putin-Kremlin administration, says that the current situation between the U.S. and Russia is worse than the Cold War. I don't know. I mean, having lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I don't think this guy did, at least not consciously, it was much worse, let me tell you. Unless there's something that I'm missing, it's not really in the same league. The other thing is, Evelyn Farkas, right? There's a Hungarian name, right? Farkas is Hungarian for the wolf. Well, Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, right? That's the level where they actually do the work. She left the Obama administration around Halloween of 2015, and she has been on cable television, and she says essentially that a lot of stuff was gathered by the intelligence community about Russiagate before the transition, right, before the inauguration, and that she says she was part of an effort, which was to some degree spontaneous, to try to preserve all of that evidence, not allow it to be concentrated in one place and one place only, because then it would be destroyed. So the principal tactic she had was share it with the intelligence committees on the Hill in Congress and other congressional end users of some of this stuff, and essentially get it up on the Hill. Get the info to the Hill is what Farkas says, because they were afraid that the material itself might be destroyed by the new administration, and or that the methods, the surveillance methods, right, the sources, the methods, the techniques, sources and methods might be deliberately wrecked so that you couldn't find out any more. Now, this doesn't mean that there was wiretapping of Trump Tower or anything of the sort. It simply means that through these various methods, a bunch of stuff was collected, right? So we've got Hannity screaming bloody murder. We've got Mark Levin, the usual cast of characters, right? The representatives of, I used to call them the representatives of the level of opinion, right? The lowest level of epistemology for Plato, remember, is opinion. That's the worst. Then there's a middle level of understanding, and then there's the top level of reason. But this is now the level of opinion. I'm afraid we're going to have to add another one. There's got to be something even worse than opinion, and I'm thinking of calling it hallucination or something like this. In other words, raving insanity or a hallucination. So anyway, these reactionary spokesmen are saying, oh, look, this proves that the Donald was right when he claimed that he had been wiretapped. So that's Evelyn Farkas. Now, I could also say this is obviously Russophobia, let's say. Just because they're against the current administration doesn't mean they're reliable. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We're already at our final segment here for the last program of the first quarter of 2017. Now let me think about the politics of this. I think that the general idea is that the Trump White House is now getting involved in a feud with significant elements of the House of Representatives. This is unwise. in the extreme, you would think that there would be a primordial awareness that above and beyond any policy issue whatsoever, it is imperative, if you want to stay in office, to maintain the good graces of the House of Representatives, because that's where impeachment can be voted. And it's therefore better not to antagonize these people, but instead we see, for example, on March 24th, a tweet. The irony is that the Freedom Caucus, right, the Tea Party extremists, which is very pro-life and against Planned Parenthood, allows Planned Parenthood to continue because they voted against, we're going to vote against Ryan Care and Trump Care, which is, of course, the same. Obamacare will explode, and we will all get together and piece together a great health care plan for the people. Do not worry. Well, and then we had the endorsement of Judge Janine's program on Saturday, which turned out to be her call to oust Ryan. Was this a coincidence? I frankly do not know. And then in the more recent days, we've had explicitly naming members of the Tea Party caucus, right? I guess at least the intent is to embarrass them. By the way, on the way to this, why doesn't the fake news talk about Podesta's ties to Russia? Well, we did. On this program, we did. We said Podesta's brother was a lobbyist for a Russian bank, and we gave that due weight. Right? That was another reason, as we put it, to vote for Bernie Sanders in the primary, right? Despite Bernie's obvious inadequacies. So the Freedom Caucus will hurt the entire Republican agenda if they don't get on the team and fast. We must fight them, Dems, in 2018. And then we have even a bunch of them are named. If Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, and Raul Labrador would get on board, we would have great health care and massive tax cuts and reforms. So singing tomorrows. Where are Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, and Raul Labrador when it comes to repeal and replace Obamacare? So you get the idea, right? This is picking a fight. Now, what had happened the last couple of days, right? We have Trump coming out saying it's time to fight the Tea Party and the Democrats. So like these are the same. Justin Amash, one of the Freedom Caucus characters, said, well, this is the logic of a 5-year-old, and the swamp has drained the president. The president pledged to drain the swamp, but like so many others, the swamp drained him. The answer to that was apparently from the Oval Office tweet, we want to cooperate with Democrats to get something done, right? This is completely utopian as far as I can see, because his demand is to repeal Obamacare. This seems to be totally incompatible. So cooperate with the Democrats. Ryan then answers, I don't want to cooperate with Democrats. This has got to be a Republican show. And then Corker from the Senate, right, from the Foreign Relations Committee says, wait a minute, Ryan, you should cooperate with those Democrats. So the rending of the Republican Party, and, where are they headed? As I said, up until November, it had seemed to me, up until this combination of Comey and the FBI, the Russiagate meddling, the wrecking of the Voting Rights Act by the Scalia court a year or two before, it looked to me like the Republican Party was quite reasonably on its way to demise. In other words, to go the way of the Whig Party after 1852, right? After the Winfield Scott defeat in the presidential election by Franklin Pierce in 1852, as I recall it. That's where the Republicans were headed, and that is where I think they continue to be. They have bought themselves a brief surcease, right? They've gotten themselves a brief lease on life through the current administration. But we can see that this is so unstable and so labile and so turbulent that it cannot be relied on before too long. The other thing is the awakening of the voters out there, right? If you go to, I think it's Alternet, right? Go to Alternet and you will find the stories of 4 devotees of the Trump campaign who now say that they feel that their confidence was misplaced. One of them is a guy called Craig Moss. He was known as the Trump troubadour, bringing his guitar to 45 campaign rallies or something like this. His son died of a heroin overdose, and he's then shocked by the plan that in the Trump Care, Ryan Care, addiction services will not be included. And then you have other people who also feel that they were let down. We can also see this as reflected in the Limbaugh program. Limbaugh says that he's getting lots and lots of emails and calls from listeners who say, stop boasting about the Republicans winning and the Democrats losing. The Republicans are not winning, according to the Limbaugh listeners, that the president's heart is not in it. Look at that bill. That was not the repeal of Obamacare. He didn't even know or care what was in it, and so forth. So Limbaugh is forced to address an obvious disaffection, right, a sense of disappointment, and he's got to bring this on the air. So it is, as I said, extremely unwise to attack the House of Representatives, either the Speaker or the opposition, right? And, of course, this place is now honeycombed with factions. You get the Tuesday group, who are the moderates, so-called. You got the Ryan group, which supposedly the center, but it means the center right to the right. And you've also got then the study group, who are reactionaries, and the Freedom Caucus, who are extreme reactionaries. So that's who you have. And if you did not have gerrymandering and money from billionaires, dark money from billionaires under Citizens United, you would not have this. This is not an authentic political party. And if you could break up some of those connections, right, cause them to lapse, then that would become obvious. Now, the other thing is, what are the two answers, right? Just remember, concerning affairs with Russia, we have an answer. What should happen with Russia is an international treaty the U.S. and Russia could start. No more color revolutions and no more hybrid warfare, no more active measures. These both represent interference, meddling in the internal affairs of sovereign states, and therefore are banned under the UN Charter and should be banned again. The other one is what to do domestically. You need a two-pronged approach. Go back to Iran-Contra. This worked well, or reasonably well. Well, not as well as it could have. It could have gone all the way to Georgia.